A real crime. In a series of podcasts, I want you to travel down some lonely roads with me. These are the roads I traveled with families who never got to say goodbye to loved ones. These family members were fated to live the rest of their lives waiting and wondering. I will begin this series with unsolved murders, but I will also revisit cases that include arrests because aspects of the case are worth re-examining. I wrote these stories when I worked as a reporter for the Charleston Gazette. Thanks for joining me today. I want to look at a murder whose brutality still shocks us today. Sadly, no one has been held accountable for the murder of a 34-year-old mother of two children. Episode 31, Tortured Beauty. The last image of Cathy Carroll presents absolute horror. Her final minutes of life were pure torture. Everyone agreed she was a physically beautiful woman, and she was selected as a beauty queen in her high school. People who knew her also said she had an inner beauty, but whoever decided to murder her wanted her to suffer. In 2022, we witness indiscriminate gun violence almost daily, but Cathy's killer did not want a quick, merciful shot. Does that give us insight into the killer's mind? The first police officer to see the victim told a magistrate what he saw. Fayette County Deputy Pete Lopez testified that Carroll had a cord around her neck and one end of the cord was tied to her bed. Her clothes were neatly folded on the bed beside her. A powder like talcum had been poured down her throat. Her hands were tied behind her back, and duct tape crossed her mouth. Cathy Roberts Drennan Carroll was 34 when she was found dead April the 22nd, 1986, in her house a few miles away from Montgomery, West Virginia. Years later, the state medical examiner would give more details about Cathy when he testified in Fayette County Circuit Court. Dr. Irvin Sofer pointed out that white talcum powder in a liberal volume was sprinkled across her eyes, nostrils, and the bridge of her nose. Sofer said he could not explain why powder was splashed across her face. Rhetorically, he asked, was it symbolic? Sofer found duct tape on Cathy's face and wrist. He also testified he found a laceration on her head from blunt force. The blunt force created a U-shaped laceration. Perhaps the attacker wore a large ring, he said. To return to the day of the murder, Cathy's daughter from her first marriage was also raped by the murderer. After getting off the school bus at about 3 p.m., the child walked up the road to her house in Montgomery Heights and entered the house as she normally would after a school day. But a masked man wearing a green army jacket stepped out of her bedroom closet. He had a gun in his hand. He tied her up and attacked her sexually. The murderer also wore a hat and towel around his head to cover his hair. He told the child to stay on her bed and warned her not to make any sounds. The attacker continued to wait for Cathy to come to her house after a day of work at Montgomery City Hall. Cathy drove up to her house as usual. She was bringing in groceries and called to her daughter. After Cathy saw the masked man, she cried out, "Jean, don't!" Her daughter called to her from her room, "It's not Jean." Robert Eugene Carroll was the man Cathy hoped to divorce the next day, April the 23rd, 1986. In the house along West Virginia 61, the mother's bedroom and the daughter's bedroom had a bathroom between them. From her bedroom, Cathy's daughter could hear the murderer hitting her mother. As time ticked on, Cathy's daughter waited and worried. When she realized the house was quiet, she also discovered her sweat had loosened the duct tape that held a cover over her eyes. She raced from her bedroom into the bathroom and shut the only locking door in the house. She managed to cut the screen to the bathroom window with nail clippers and climb out. Even though she was not fully clothed, she ran to a neighbor's house for help. The brutality of this rape and murder and the idea that a mother and child were not safe in their house sent shockwaves around the county. People were afraid for themselves, and some people who never had a gun in their houses before got guns. But of course, these were not two random acts of violence. These were deliberate and planned. One prosecutor even called them prophecies. No one needed to worry that they might be the next victim. Before I continue with the Carroll case, I want to return to a fateful irony I mentioned in a previous episode. Donald Woods, who also lived in a small valley community not far from Montgomery Heights, was searching for his missing daughter when he met Cathy for the first and only time. Wood's daughter Teresa never made it home after a day at Collins Middle School in Oak Hill. Woods created posters asking people to call him if they saw his daughter. He brought one to Montgomery City Hall to put on display. Cathy copied posters and promised to help him. In months after that meeting, Wood's daughter would be found murdered June the 6th, 1986. Donald Woods grieved the rest of his life for his firstborn child, and he tried to find her murderer. Now, 36 years later, no one has been arrested for the murder of the 13-year-old. After Cathy was murdered, her father, Edward Roberts, would become friends with Donald Woods. The two fathers of murdered daughters comforted each other in their grief. In separate interviews, both fathers told me that they believed the grief they endured shortened the lives of several family members. Donald Woods was only 62 when he died. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts brought their granddaughter to live in their Oak Hill home after their daughter was murdered. Mr. Roberts told me that many nights his granddaughter would cry out from horrible nightmares of what she had experienced. Both Mr. and Mrs. Roberts told me they hoped to live to see someone prosecuted for their daughter's murder. Sadly, both died without this hope fulfilled. Cathy, an acknowledged beauty, was married to an older, unattractive man, Robert Eugene Carroll. On several occasions, he demonstrated that he feared other men might take her away from him. He threatened and stalked several of her co-workers. He was ordered to stay away from her workplace. He put chalk marks on the street where she parked her car so he would know if the car moved. At different times, Cathy and her sister, Connie Alexander, had traveled to Parkersburg, Beckley, and Huntington together. Connie testified in court that no matter where they went, they would see Cathy's husband. In the days before Cathy's murder, her co-workers would say Gene was everywhere. If she walked down the street, he shouted at her. He seemed to know her every move. Gene Carroll was married previously to another attractive woman, and the two had a daughter. He was court-ordered to pay child support for her. After Cathy told him she wanted a divorce, Carroll announced he would never pay child support again. He even threatened to kill a circuit judge who ordered him to pay. Word circulated on the streets that he was also looking for someone to kill Cathy. He came to her house one evening and counted out $5,000 on their dining room table. He told her he now had enough money to have her killed. In later court hearings, two men would testify that Gene offered them money to kill his wife. Both men testified they turned him down. Gene Carroll also had a reputation for being cruel to Cathy. Cathy's sister would later point out that Cathy treasured her china cabinet. Once on his way out of the house, he threw something into the china cabinet just to be sure to break some items Cathy cared about, her sister said. Even one of Carroll's own lawyers would say in court Gene Carroll did not treat his wife well. Who had motive to kill Cathy? Obviously her husband. She was hours away from a divorce hearing. All social workers will say a domestic violence victim is in the most danger when she attempts to leave her abuser. Carroll threatened other men. He could have thought he was stopping her from being with someone else. But Cathy's father described Carroll as money crazy. When former Fayette County Sheriff Bill Laird started to investigate the case, he laid out a paper trail. Carroll denied Cathy money he rightfully owed her at every turn. Because the two were still married at her death, Carroll filed successfully for money through the state's Victims' Compensation Fund. After Cathy died, he made a tiny bit of money through the Crime Victims Fund. He benefited from an insurance policy that paid off the house, and he sold the house for more than he and Cathy paid for it. Not much money, to be sure, but to his way of thinking, he also saved money he could have been court-ordered to pay Cathy. Perhaps his version of math was a motivator. Gene Carroll was court-ordered not to bother his wife at her workplace or house, but he routinely violated those orders. The houses in Montgomery Heights sit close together. Several of his neighbors saw Gene Carroll in their neighborhood on the day of his wife's murder. One neighbor said she waved at Gene, and he waved back to her. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Tommy Siner for his always great work, and thanks to Brenda Pinnell for her technical skills. Please join me next Wednesday for a new episode of A Real Crime with Susan Williams, and I will talk about how this case ended.